Okay, so I'd just like to introduce Professor Alan Morrison. So Alan Morrison is the Professor of Law and Finance at Oxford Saïd and a Fellow of Merton College. And he teaches the core module on our Executive MBA of Governance and Ethics. So Alan's here to give you a quick introduction of what it would be like maybe in his class, but whilst you're here at Oxford. So yes, I think everybody enjoys it. Over to you, Alan.
Thank you. So I was told I had to speak to you for an hour about anything at all. And I thought I would take a little bit of what I teach on my core course and shorten it so I could do it in an hour. So the course is, as you heard, is called Governance and Ethics. It's a sort of philosophically charged look at the way organizations operate and questions about what you ought to do in business. It goes over remarkably well with members who understand that these things matter when you sit on boards. And at the heart of the course are two things. Firstly, a bunch of ethical theories. You know, what does it mean to be ethical? What ought you to do? What ought you not to do? What is a human right? Stuff like that comes up all the time when you're running businesses. And the other is, what does governance mean? And that's quite a hard question. Most of the time when people say governance, they mean something like committee structure, but that seems to me vacuous. There must be something deeper at the heart of governance. And if we have time, maybe I'll be able to tell you what I think corporate governance is today. In order to tell you what corporate governance is, I need to tell you something about what I think an organization is. And again, maybe that feels obvious. You know, you go to work, you hang around with a bunch of people, you do stuff together, there's a control structure, so you're an organization, and that's not so unreasonable way to think about things. But it turns out it's really hard to put your finger on this and to do serious work on the nature of organizations. So I'm a professional law and finance, although these days my work is more ethical and ontological. And in economics and finance, we think of organizations as being places where people go to write contracts. So if I were teaching you the core finance module, or indeed bits of the core economics, I'd start by drawing a picture of a firm, and I'd say, okay, what's a firm? So you're now ready for the finance course if you've done. A firm's a thing where people write contracts. So you have some customers, they write contracts with the firm, and then you have suppliers who also write contracts with the firm. Of course, the customer could write a contract directly with the supplier, doesn't. I go to Marks and Spencer and buy socks. Marks and Spencer buys socks from the supplier. It saves me the bother of finding the supplier. And of course, there are workers writing contracts and a whole bunch of other people. The government, for example, landlords. Lots of people deal with the firm. And when you start drawing pictures like this, you realize that there's nothing inside here. It's a legal construction that allows people to write contracts with each other and they can own property. So economists often tell themselves a firm is just a place to write contracts. The phrase they use is, the firm is a nexus of contracts. So it's an extraordinarily influential way to think about firms. It's at the heart of at least 3 Nobel Prizes. And it informs the whole of the economics course that you take here, or much of it, and the whole of the finance course you take here. So who else is writing contracts? Well, I guess, given that it informs the finance course, one of the bunches of people who write contracts are investors. So I could think of a share or a bond as a type of contract that I write with all these other people. But rather than going around them individually, I write a contract with the firm, and the firm writes contracts with everyone else. Of course, the firm can't write a contract, so we have someone called a manager who writes a contract with the firm, and once the manager's written a contract with the firm, the manager then writes contracts on behalf of the firm with other people. But it all feels incredibly unhuman. There's something very dry about this. It's a useful analytic tool, and it sits at the heart of quite a lot of the core courses you do. But I don't think, and the reason I now do the sort of research I do, the sort of teaching I do, is I don't think this fully captures what an organization is. So I'm just kind of interested to know who I've got in the room. How many of you have a finance background? So you guys are, even if you're not aware of it, are familiar with this way of thinking about the firm, because you know about bonds and shares and things, you know about contract reviews. How many of you work in HR? Nobody? Okay, so you're probably going to be closer to what I'm going to talk about today in some ways. And comms, anyone do that sort of thing? Okay, comms is very close to what I'm going to talk about today, so that might fit in. I'm going to talk about, and how many of you, just for fun, how many of you have got a background in philosophy? Well, last time I gave a talk like this, it was a 1-hour talk. and I got into a massive argument with the guy who turned out. I get into massive arguments all the time. That's part of the point of teaching. But this guy had a PhD in philosophy, and I realised that everyone else was watching them. I want to get a when I talk like this, and it's an easy point to make. If I just think of a firm as a place that writes contracts, I can't attribute to the firm things like value statements. That's meaningless, right? Because the firm's just a thing that writes contracts. I can't attribute to the firm a purpose particularly. I could attribute a purpose to the people who write contracts to the firm. But understanding the firm as a thing with a purpose or a thing with a set of values is really hard to do in a standard economic conception of the firm. So one of the things that a course like the one I teach on the IMBA gets at is just at quite a deep level, what allows us to use that sort of language. And the title I chose for today's talk is Can Corporations Think? And if a corporation, this is not a trivial question, right? So let's take an example. Here's HSBC's website. I downloaded this over Easter for a different lecture. So this is what HSBC says about itself. HSBC says we value difference, we succeed together, we take responsibility, and we get it done. So let's take number one. Number one, HSBC says we value difference. Does anyone know how many people work for HSBC? You work for HSBC?
No, oh, sorry, I work with.
Oh, how many people work for HSBC? Do you know what the number of employees is? Make a wild guess.
Rolled round,
Yeah.
all around the world,
Yeah.
20,000.
That's
No.
100,000.
It's well over 100,000, yeah. So 100,000 people working for HSBC around the world. Do they all value difference? Catriona, what do you think? Do they all value difference?
I believe they are told to do that, but I
Okay,
don't
so
know.
if I told, I don't know you at all, but I'm going to say to you, I'm going to pronounce this, Katerina. And I say, Katerina, come and work for me. And while you're working for me, you love cricket. And I put a thing on my website saying, we love cricket. I've told you to love cricket. Do you now love cricket? Of course you don't. You have no idea what I'm talking about. Most people don't love cricket, and I don't think everybody values difference. And maybe with a workforce of 5, I could say that. With a workforce of 120,000, which is I think about the right number, it goes up and down. I don't think I can say that. And yet we say that all the time. We say stuff like this about organizations. We take responsibility. Anyone who works in an organization knows there are plenty of people in an organization who refuse to take responsibility for anything. And yet, HSBC says it takes responsibility and it gets it done and moves at pace. Once again, it's Friday afternoon. Somewhere in the world, someone at HSBC is doing Facebook at work. They don't necessarily get it done all the time. And yet this language doesn't seem ridiculous, right? When I read this sort of thing, I think I'm learning something about HSBC. But if I think of HSBC as a whole bunch of different people writing contracts to the legal fiction, I don't think I can make sense of this statement. So I have to add something to this picture. This picture is accurate, but it's not complete. Okay, how many of you are familiar with The Body Shop? Okay, so some of you have never heard of it. The Body Shop is a cosmetics company that is very concerned with environmental standards and with certain social issues. So it's very, very careful about what sort of things happen in the supply chain. It's very, very careful about the animals, the relationship it has with animals in the natural world on things like cosmetics testing. And they say this sort of, and this all dates back, I think, to their founder, who's a woman called Anita Roddick, who had a very, very strong set of personal values that informed the way she did business. And it's kind of what you said, Katerina. People came to Body Shop and they were told, this is what we believe. And they can't all have believed it. And yet it doesn't seem ridiculous. So this is what the Body Shop says about itself. It says, we are a feminist brand and empowering women and girls is at the heart of everything we do. We want our products to be an expression of self-love when women use them, and we reject the beauty industry's rules on how our bodies should look. We promote women's self-esteem, celebrate female leadership, and through our community fair trade program, we work to bring employment and to help empower communities all over the world. Quite strong stuff. Vicky, do you think everybody at the Body Shop signs up to this?
Probably not.
Do
But I'd say
you think it's a sincere statement about the Body Shop?
it's an aspiration to have that kind of culture.
Yeah, I mean, were you one of the people who's familiar with the Body Shop? Yeah, I mean, I know people who work very high up, like an old Edinburgh student was on the board of Body Shop. Do you think the is this an accurate statement of Body Shop is not one of the workers, but can we talk about Body Shop as having these values? Is that a coherent statement? John, what do you think? Can Body Shop be said to have these values?
I think they can.
And yet the standard economic model
Disagree.
weren't allowed to do that, which means the standard economic model is wrong. It just seems intuitively obvious to me that I can say this sort of thing, even though I can't say it uniformly about everybody who's in the standard economic picture of the firm. So one of the things I'm trying to do in my research and that I'm trying to do in my teaching is to make sense of this sort of thing. I want to know if it's okay to talk as if organizations have minds, because that's what we're doing when we say we believe all this stuff. We're not, I think we've established that no individual person in Body Shop necessarily believes all of this stuff. And yet we can meaningfully say Body Shop believes all this stuff. That is quite confusing to me. So does anyone have a very strong background in economics? Or a background in economics? Yeah. So Dugu. So when I have a strong background in economics, I have a PhD in economics, and for a long time I taught students it was not okay to talk as if organizations have minds. So what you're hearing is the result of an intellectual journey for me. So if you're thinking like an economist, why is this not okay? Or maybe certain types of other social science disciplines. Why is it weird to talk about organizations as having minds, as having beliefs, as having this sort of thing?
Most of them are for profit. Is it about?
But I could be a completely money-obsessed person. I still have a mind.
Because these are just concepts. Then they don't really exist. So
Organizations feel like concepts, right? They feel like, in fact, it is true to say most Body Shop is a legal device, right? The properties of an organization that make it a corporation in law, and then it can write contracts and it can own property. And a couple of other things, but that's the basic stuff, right? So we make these things up as just social constructions, as legal constructions that allow us to do stuff. I have a brain. If you carved my head in half, you'd find it in there. I can't even find a person inside this box. So to talk as if the organization has a mind feels difficult, right? It feels conceptually troubling. How do I get around this? What sort of strategy might I adopt?
I think that it depends on your understanding of the term mind, because if you refer to human brain as a box for mind, it functions as a multitude of neurons together, which each of those neurons does not have any conscience or mind, but together they have. So referring to an organization, it works in a similar way. So you could think of a particular man as having no corporate mind, but when they work together,
So
they act as a neural network and as a brain together, and they show some corporate behavior that could be.
So I think that's very close to what I'm about to say. So what you're saying goes back to the 19th century, although the phrase neural network didn't appear when Hegel wrote it down. But the idea that each of us, when we work together, something happens that's a bit like the senseless neurons in a brain coming together to create something, I think it's true, but I think it's more than that, because we're not senseless neurons. I'm capable of reasoning and you're capable of reasoning, and yet when we join an organization, something happens that means that we reason together in some complicated and interesting way. And I think understanding corporate governance requires us to understand that. But a corporation clearly doesn't have grey matter. It's a construct, and we have to have some argument about distributed intelligence to make this work. Any other guesses about where we might go with this? What do you think? What am I adding to the box with arrows and people writing contracts? Maybe I'm adding some sort of. So you're making a statement about what happens when people work together. They collectively come to some understanding, and together their brains work as a corporate brain.
I could be mistaken, but yeah, from my experience, when there are just a few people working together, not always they start talking about things such as values, missions, and so forth. It's more about down to down to earth activities, like about signing those contracts and fulfilling those contracts. But any large company hardly exists without some goals and mission in view.
Right, but the goal and mission, where does an organization's mission come from, Lewis?
People within it.
Right, does it just come down from the top?
Depends obviously on the size of the scale of it, but
I wonder if it does. So I wasn't sure whether to project this slide, but Dimitri has convinced me that I should. So I was going to skip this, but let's talk about this. So this is the best novel ever written, Pride and Prejudice, from Jane Austen. How many of you are familiar with Pride and Prejudice, at least to some extent? Okay, so some of you are, and who's not familiar with Pride and Prejudice? Not at all. No one? Everyone's read Pride and Prejudice or seen the TV. Okay, that's interesting. Usually there's at least one person who's never seen it or heard of it. Let's talk a bit about Pride and Prejudice. I want to understand how this corporate mind works. So let's have something in mind. This is a completely imaginary thing, right? Just like the corporation. So I think I can maybe start to understand corporate purpose by understanding Pride and Prejudice. And talking about Pride and Prejudice in a classroom is brilliant. I sometimes can't believe I get paid for this stuff. So let me remind you of the plot in case you're not quite as familiar with it as you think you are. Pride and Prejudice is about 5 daughters of Mr. and Mrs. Bennet, who live in the Hampshire countryside just outside of London, and they're living there towards the end of the Napoleonic Wars. And Napoleon and the wars don't get mentioned once, although there are lots of officers. Their role is to be dashing and marriageable. So Lizzie Bennet or Elizabeth Bennet, or Liza Bennet, is the heroine. And I want to, so how many of you think you understand Lizzie Bennet? So, Muklu, do you understand Lizzie Bennet?
Get it, but
So tell me a little bit about Lizzie Bennet in broad terms. What sort of a person is she?
she's judgmental, isn't she? She makes decisions based on not enough information, and she's wrong in the end.
Interesting. It's my favorite novel. I'm not sure I'd put it quite like that. She does make judgments. Yeah. Who else wants to chip in on the nature of Lizzie Bennet? Yeah. Sorry, I can't. Mark.
Is she a non-conformist? Right, given the society that she lives in, she doesn't necessarily play by the rules.
She's often a non-conformist, although in the end she buckles down to English social mores. But she's often a non-conformist, and because she's a non-conformist, she does make unusual judgments, at least by the standards of her time. So she's often a non-conformist. Okay, what else can we say about her? You're all experts a minute ago. She's a feminist. I think she's an 19th century feminist, early 19th century feminist. So she's some sort of early although of course the word hadn't entered the lexicon back then. She feels to me like a feminist. Anything else?
Very bold.
She's bold. Yeah, I think she's bold. She's extremely bold. In fact, she's criticised by Mrs. Catherine de Bourgh for being too bold. That's an insult in Catherine de Bourgh's lexicon, because she says exactly what she thinks. Anything else about Lizzie Bennet? She lives in the countryside with her 4 sisters. So, and her father is wealthy and doesn't work. Her mother doesn't work either. So she lives with her family. Social class? Can we say anything about that? You haven't read it, have you? What do you think, Krill? What's a social class?
it's like maintaining the standard with, rich, poor.
That's what a social class is, but what's her social class? Where does Lizzie Bennet fit into the hierarchy?
She's rich poor. I think like
Yeah.
they're keeping up the charades
Classy.
because she's trying to marry because they know it's going to end. They're trying to marry up.
Right, so her father has an entailed estate which would pass on to the male line, and there are no boys, there are 5 daughters. So they're currently well off, they're going to be poor. So they're kind of they're upper bourgeois, but they're worried about money. Okay, so now we know what she's like. Let's transplant it to modern day New York. So 21st century Lizzie Bennet living in New York. Or if you don't know New York, pick a different metropolitan.
London.
Okay, let's pick London. We all know. Okay. Tell me what Lizzie Bennet's life is like in 21st century London. Jamie, what do you think? Where does she live?
Clapham.
She lives in Clapham. Excellent.
In a flat share, a couple of mates from Exeter
Exeter University.
University.
Okay. Fletcher. Exeter University.
What's special about that place?
Not about Exeter. But about
Clapham.
Clapham. Clapham's it's sort of quite well. It's where you sort of live, I think, in London if you're kind of young and went to boarding school.
It's actually true, yeah. So, she lives on that river. Okay, okay, so she lives in Clapham. She has friends from Exeter. What, does she have a job? What's her job? She must have a job.
Yeah, it's PR.
Is that in line with all this? Do you think she's a PR person?
Journalists.
Journalist? What sort of journalist?
Provocative.
Okay, so provocative journalist, but she's not writing clickbait pieces, right? She's doing serious journalism. Okay, so
Guerrilla manifesto.
okay, so she's just provocative. I can't spell guerrilla manifesto, so I just write provocative. I can't spell provocative either. Provocative, that'll do. Provocative journalist. Okay, we're getting a good picture. So it didn't feel right to make her a PR person, but people feel comfortable with journalist. What else do we know about her? What does she wear?
Oh, I don't know what she wears, but I was gonna say she's single, she has no kids, she's probably traveled, and yeah, she's well read.
Single, no kids. Traveled?
Probably, yeah.
Probably still a feminist.
Probably still a feminist. That seems to me integral. Okay, okay, so would she, for example, marry a wealthy person for money? It doesn't feel like it, right? She's not mercenary. So she's going to, if she marries, she'll marry for love. So she's not a seeker. At least no more. She is a money seeker in the book, but that's not her primary goal. She views it as a necessary constraint. What else? What else can we say? What does she wear? Would she walk around in motorcycle wears?
Cycling.
Sorry?
She would be cycling,
Bicycle.
bicycle.
Interesting. My MBA class, I did a much longer version of this in my MBA class, and they had her in long flowing dresses, but you have her on a bicycle kit, okay? Does she have a mountain bike or a racing bike or a big black bike with a basket on the front?
She's got a Brompton.
She's got a Brompton. That's absolutely brilliant. She has a Brompton, yeah. We have a pretty good picture. So we've established things she won't do. She's not a money seeker. Does she go clubbing? Or does she go to classical music concerts? Or does she go to Elton John concerts?
Elton John.
She doesn't feel like a clubber to me, right? I can't see her taking MDMA and going to a club. I can't see her in an Elton John. So we have a picture of Lizzie Bennet, and we just made her up. I think what you're describing, Dimitri, is what's happening here. We have something in our heads, and I did this with my MBA students for a quarter of an hour to embark on a lecture about what a firm is. But by then, we were having quite detailed discussions. She was in New York, living on the Upper West Side, but we were having quite detailed discussions about her life, her love interests, what she wanted to do when she was a bit older, how many kids she wanted to have. And they started arguing quite passionately about what she was. And eventually because there were a few people who really were Pride and Prejudice geeks in the room, and eventually they settled on a very precise understanding of what sort of a person she was. And yet we just invented her, right? We have a very clear understanding of her. In fact, if you discovered that if I wrote a book about this Lizzie Bennet, and I wrote into the book that she had in fact married for money and was deeply unhappy, how would you feel about the Lizzie Bennet you met? Would you be disappointed in her, or comfortable, or happy? We've all read books where the heroes and heroines don't do things we like them to do. How would you feel in this case? I put Lizzie Bennet in a flat share in London. She's single, she's genuine, she's a provocative journalist. Or supposing I write this book and halfway through she takes a bribe to suppress a story. How would that playing. Would that be Lizzie Bennett?
No, it's out of character.
Totally out of character. You feel like there was something wrong and you feel like I lied to you. You feel like I've written the wrong book. And this happens, right? We read books and we think that the author has failed to describe what's actually going on. It turns out, there's a big literature on this. When people interpret a book together, they feel even more strongly about it. They start to come to, they discuss the book. This guy called Stanley Fish, who wrote a famous book about this, called Is There a Text in This Class? About what happens when communities of people come together to discuss literature. They end up with a really clear picture of what ought to happen, which might not be what the author makes happen at all. Maybe something like that's going on for Lizzie Bennett, because we can think about Lizzie Bennett and we're pretty clear what we think she's doing. And you know, if someone had said something different, we might have a different picture. But the more we talk about this, the more we're going to get a concrete understanding of the nature of Lizzie Bennett. So let's try the same game for The Body Shop. So The Body Shop is another fictitious construct, as Dimitri said, created by law to write contracts and own property, right? But the moment we start talking about it, we can do this sort of thing. We can attach stuff to it in conversation. We can have a dialogue. We can argue passionately about what The Body Shop is. So let's think on behalf of The Body Shop, not on behalf of yourself. You can do this. You just thought on behalf of Lizzie Bennett. She doesn't even exist. The Body Shop does exist. So you're not yourself. You're trying to understand what The Body Shop would do. I'm not Lizzie Bennett, and I think I understand exactly what she would do. Same sort of thing. So when you're thinking for The Body Shop, what do you think about equality in the workplace? This is your view, this is The Body Shop's view, but you kind of have an understanding what The Body Shop is. So let's play the same game for Body Shop as we did for Lizzie Bennett. Andrea,
More familiar enough with Body Shop.
okay, well, you've seen what they think. Okay, you can I'll come back to you and make your guess. So far, you know what Body Shop thinks about female empowerment.
Yeah.
They're all for it, and they are against body shaming. The questions coming up later. I think they're probably against body shaming. Okay, so Vicky, you are an expert on Body Shop. How do you think they feel about equality in the workplace?
DEI is very high on the agenda.
Yeah. So we have a list of things for Lizzie Bennett. She's a fiction, right? The Body Shop isn't a fiction, but it is a kind of legal fiction. That's what Dimitri said. So The Body Shop is a thing we think about and form views about, just as Lizzie Bennett is. The first thing I think is that it is pro diversity and inclusion.
Wouldn't that be for any fictitious
Really?
organization now?
So they'd all say they were. So I do this sometimes, and I put a Body Shop next to a big oil company, and I say, how does Body Shop feel about the environment? Everyone goes, oh, Body Shop runs the environment. I say, okay, how does this big oil company feel about the environment? Everyone, people are mixed. They say, well, they certainly say they care about the environment, but actually, no one thinks they do. So there is a difference between what they say about themselves sometimes and what they actually are. We're trying to understand what they are. I think Body Shop actually is pro this stuff. I have friends at organizations that quite obviously are not, but say they are. If you were working at Uber 6 years ago, you'd have had a corporate statement that said you were completely in favor of respecting the workplace. And yet they had a culture from the top to the bottom which riddled with sexual harassment. Therefore, if you ask what does Uber think about this, you can say Uber thinks this is fine because that's what they keep doing. So I'm trying to think on behalf of Body Shop, and I think they are genuinely pro diversity and inclusion. I think you did say it, so diversity and inclusion. Okay, what else? We also, what do they think about, I'm kind of giving this away. What do they think about deforestation in the rainforest? What does Body Shop think? Maybe you haven't got an opinion on this, but maybe you can guess what Body Shop's opinion is. Mike, what do you think?
I think they're probably, yeah, four.
They're in favour of deforestation. They have a big thing on their website about this. They won't buy cosmetics that have involved, so they're pro-forest too. Now, again, every firm in the world says it's pro-forest, but some of them do an awful lot of deforestation. So,
But they're not gonna advertise it.
no, they're not.
We're
They could.
pro this-
I could say to you, I'm a lovely person and be an awful person, and I could say I'm against deforestation and be totally for it. And the way you find out is by looking at what I do. And more to the point, what people in the organization understand, even if they don't explicitly talk about it, the organization to be. So they look at that and they say to themselves, We say we're anti-deforestation, but actually, we're not. I've had conversations with people in the charity sector who say we'll never pay a bribe in public. Then you have lunch with them, go, yeah, we say that. But we do. So they have a picture in their heads, just like we have one of 21st century Lizzie and we have one of the Body Shop, and the picture in their heads, people in the Body Shop actually think this. They think that's how they make decisions. These are maybe too easy. We know what they think about body shaming, I've already told you. They are in favor of a diversity of body shapes. I think I can kind of understand how they'll think about all sorts of issues that have got nothing to do with making money. I'm sure they're pro making money, but they have other attitudes as well. Okay, let's talk about something harder. Andrea, you have to make a guess now. You've now been introduced to Body Shop. What do they want to accomplish in the world apart from making money?
They want to make it a better place. Or they want to make it, they want to sell shampoos.
I think it's some shampoos, but
I know about body.
They want to empower.
they want to empower women. They definitely want to empower women.
They want to empower women. Yeah, that's what we read.
They want to make money and they want to empower women.
Yeah.
Anything else they want to accomplish?
Preserve the environment.
They're very conservative in the environment. Laura?
They want to create positive body images, right?
Yeah. So they have a bunch of things they want to accomplish in the world. It's quite possible that some of the people in this room have never thought about much of this stuff, or not in the last few weeks. But when you're thinking like Body Shop, you understand that you want to empower women, that you want to protect the environment. You obviously want to sell cosmetics. So I actually let's write that down. That's one of the other things you want to do. You want to flog cosmetics.
They are a public company?
Sorry?
Are they public?
They were now they're owned by L'Oréal. So one of the interesting questions is to what extent you can sustain this set of beliefs when you're owned by an organization that might not share them. But we only have an hour and I'm just trying to introduce you to a way of thinking. Okay. This is kind of interesting. A philosopher was saying that we're writing down what a philosopher will call intentional states. Now, an intentional state doesn't mean what you intend to do. The language here is deeply confusing. Just say that you encounter some new language. This is ripped off from a series of philosophers going back to the 19th century, running through people like Jean-Paul Sartre and to a lesser extent Simone de Beauvoir, and today John Searle. And intentionality doesn't mean intent. It's a phrase that in philosophy means aboutness. The idea that when you think, you're thinking about something, when you have an attitude, you have an attitude about something. And the idea behind this whole range of things, when people talk intentionality, they're talking about the fact that consciousness does something active. When you see something, you don't just see something, you attach meaning to it. It just, according to these people, this is what humans do. I cannot help but attach meanings to stuff. That's why questions of gender and race are really complex, because whether you like it or not, you look at things and people and attributes and you attach meaning to them. Consciousness even is active, but not in the sense that you deliberately control it a lot of the time. It just attaches all of the meaning. So I look at Body Shop and I attach meaning to Body Shop. I look at Pride and Prejudice and I attach meaning to Lizzie Bennet. I've never met you guys before, but I'm attaching meaning to you because I know you're putative member students whom I might be teaching in a year's time. And I'm attaching meaning to you because you know about London, because you understand that Clapham's full of people who went to boarding school and played rugby. And, meaning comes about precisely because what my consciousness does when it encounters stuff. That's what intentionality is. Yeah.
So this would be, in other words, just categorizing.
Not quite categorizing, no. Okay, let's be careful. I don't want to do a lecture on the philosophy of mind. So categorization, are you thinking of Kant or is this just a coincidence?
Just, I would say coincidence.
Keynes?
No, coincidence, sorry.
Coincidence, okay. So what your brain's not doing is taking a reality out there and categorizing it. What your brain is doing is looking at objects, and I can understand this object is grey and black, but when I look at it, I also understand that this object advances slides. This is a trivial thing. It's not quite categorization, but it has meaning. When I look at a cup of an empty mug, I can see an empty mug, or I can see a mug that is disappointingly devoid of tea. Disappointingly devoid of tea is meaning I attach to the mug because of something about my preferences. It's kind of a category, but it's something more than that. It's a set of meanings and values that attach to stuff. When I'm running down the street after a bus, unless I stop to think about it, I just experience the bus as having a particular meaning. The bus is a thing I have to catch. That's what these guys are talking about. And it's an idea that runs through. He's writing the 1890s, he's still writing. So this is and I've done a bit of work on this. So what we're doing when we talk about Lizzie Bennet or the Body Shop is we're writing down what these guys call intentional states. And by an intentional state, maybe take a picture of the world. It might be a true or a false picture, and then decide what you think about that picture of the world. So the technical language is the picture of the world, sometimes called a proposition, and the attitude is just an attitude. So this is the sort of thing I have in mind. Here's a picture of the world. I could just describe the world getting hotter. That's a picture. I might believe that. It's my attitude. Some people, fewer and fewer of them, might be skeptical about that. That would be a different attitude. I don't know for sure, but I suspect Leeds, which is a town in the north of England, is warmer than Oslo on average. So I believe that. But I'm not entirely sure, so I could say not entirely sure of that picture. I'm absolutely convinced that cricket is better than baseball, so I'll probably go on. But you might disagree with me, in which case, if we argue this is still a picture, but my attitude towards it might change, etc. You know, I could say I'm courageous, I want that to be the case. But I could also write down something very mundane, like a new road is built by 2029. That's a picture, right? I have a picture of myself getting from here to somewhere else, and I imagine the world being new and it being there before 2029. If I want to make that happen, I could form the attitude of intention. And that's something. So I could wire that in, right? So that's what we're seeing in Body Shop, right? They want to flog cosmetics, that's an intention. So there's an intentional state there. They want to protect the environment, and they want to empower women. Some of these attitudes are attitudes that people who work there will hold, and some of them are not. And if I intend that a new road is built by 2029, next thing I might do is buy 2 tons of concrete. I might hire a bunch of people, a whole bunch of pictures of the world and attempts to make them come true follow on from some of the pictures of the world that I think in terms of. Now, this is a very formal way of thinking what goes on inside Lizzie Bennet's head. I think it's a useful way to think about what's going on inside an organization's head, because the organization, I do not intend to build a new road by 2029. But an organization that's going to build a new road could reasonably be said to have the intention of building a new road by 2029. And I do not personally intend to, for example, I do not intend to admit a class of executive MBAs in January. I can't. I'm a human being. The business school here can reasonably anticipate that it will do that and form that intention. What we're doing is writing down things that feel like statements about the mind, but they're not statements that attach to any one person. They attach to an organization. I'll be right with you. And the organization is a group of people who kind of understand these things together. So there is something about our neurons. We need all these people to sustain these pictures. Well, the picture's there because we discuss them. We consciously talk about them. And we talk about Lizzie Bennet. We understand what she looks like today. We talk about Body Shop. We understand what that looks like. And I've spoken to entrepreneurs who spend a lot of time talking about what they are and what they're going to do. They're forming something that looks a bit like a mind, and they're collectively responsible for creating it and maintaining it. So, Katerina.
So we're thinking, as an individual working in a company, right? The company's intention is to build a road. It's your intention as well, because you are so linked to the result of this.
It's interesting. So I don't think it's my intention, except that I'm at the firm. There's an interesting, complicated question about why, because of course, I keep telling myself I've got to stop by 1:15. So that I, of course, intend to do stuff. In order for any of this to happen, people have got to act. So Lizzie Bennet doesn't actually live in Clapham because we invented her. We kind of invented Body Shop, and we can invent whatever. The organization is building a road. In order for the road to get built, people have got to do stuff. But it could still be the case that imagine a person who wants to get something done, they persuade you to do something to help them. Maybe that's one way to think about this. You're willing to be persuaded that you should do what the organization wants. The organization wants to do this because you and your mates have discussed what the organization wants and you now understand what it wants. So I'll be right with you, Laura. So if I kept going for another half an hour on Lizzie Bennet, you'd all got quite bored, but by the end, Andrea would have known exactly, were you the non-expert? You
I'm
were.
not an expert, but I'm becoming now.
By the end, you'd have known what was in Body Shop's brain, right? This is how, and then you could have left and he would have been the keeper of the torch for Body Shop. This is how organizations maintain continuity. I've got a bunch of lab experiments with a PhD student where we get people to tell these stories, then we slowly remove them from the picture and put other people in. 2 hours later, the same stories have been told with 7 generations of people.
See, my salary is linked to the
Yeah,
performance. of the
absolutely, yeah,
company, right?
yeah.
And maybe my bonus is linked to the performance, so I am interested in.
Yeah, you
Getting
call
that.
naturally, yeah, but it's not the same. You're doing it because the organization wants you to do it, and you think that you would like to do what the organization wants you to do. There's some complicated relationship. Laura, you're going to say something. No,
Yeah, I think what the discussion is pointing to is the importance of teams as a kind of microculture and that prism through which an organizational aim and culture is filtered to individual members, right?
yeah.
And very
I mean,
much the
dialogue,
importance of
narratives and
might have-
stories matter here. Yeah,
Yeah, microcultures in either successfully pushing change initiatives forward or indeed rebelling against them.
and what's interesting is after a bit, it can be really hard. So I can't remember who, or someone about it was you, Lewis, top down. Think of an organization that has these stories in its, in its collective DNA. And people have these stories that are really strongly held stories. Let's call those stories the corporate mind, because that's what I'm going to do. So we understand the corporate mind. It's this stuff. It's the statements, the intentional stakes that we attach to the organization. I need to come back to Catherine's point about why you actually do what the organization wants you to do. Is it because you want to do it? Not necessarily. If a close friend wants something, I might do it because I care about my close friend. That's not the same as me wanting it. But we'll come back to that. But that means these stories could be quite rigid. Supposing you're working for the Body Shop, and you've been there a long time, and you're like many Body Shop people, you absolutely think this is what the Body Shop is. And you're acquired by someone who says, you know what? Actually, what the Body Shop really is a place that flogs cosmetic and tests them on monkeys. The reaction, well, how if you were there for a long time, you thought the Body Shop was all this. Someone said, now we test on animals. Would you say you're right, okay, that's what we are? Or would you say, no, that's not what we are, you're wrong?
I think, again, what you're pointing to is actually there's not a single corporate mind, right?
There's an interesting
it's
question.
really-
I think in some instances there might be, and in some instances it might be quite scattered.
Yes.
For corporate
I mean,
mind,
in my organisation, there's probably at least 5 people in different generations.
I've worked on this. I've tried to argue elsewhere that if there are many of these things, the organisation stops to feel like an organisation. Because the reason I, throw the catches because I planned to. The reason 2 of us walk down the road together is because we plan to. If we have utterly inconsistent or incoherent plans, it's very hard to make any sense of the organisation. If we can't make any sense of it, it doesn't feel like an organisation. But let's think the Body Shop probably does have this very strong belief. People inside the Body Shop and people outside of the Body Shop understand this to be what the Body Shop is. So if someone comes in and a leader says, from now on, we're not doing that. We're doing everything except the monkey thing. Now we're testing cosmetics on monkeys. Or didn't even say that. Said this is what we are now. What would the appropriate reaction be, Alicia?
Well, I think people subscribe to the values of companies and that's why they give them their money. So if we look at Twitter and Tesla with Elon Musk right now. So Twitter used to try to monitor their platform and now it's not being monitored. And all of a sudden Tesla purchases and shares are going down.
Right, people
Because
leave.
people don't agree with it. Yeah.
My experience from talking to people undergoing serious change is one of the challenges you face when you come in and try to change these stories. Is these stories are as real to people as our picture of Lizzie Bennet or our understanding of the Body Shop. So that's why I said, okay, so does she take MDMA and go clubbing in MDMA? And you went, no, of course she doesn't. And if I'd said she did, you'd have said I was wrong. And if you shut up an organization that's been there for a long time and has these very, very deeply held stories about what it is, and just say that's not the right story, people will argue with you. This isn't something that gets dictated. It's a thing that exists collectively. It's a bit like your neurons, right? Something that exists intersubjectively because we talk about it. We've been talking about this for ages. We've all agreed this is what Lizzie Bennet is. It doesn't matter if someone comes in and writes a book about her where she does something else. It won't change our minds. We'll just say that person is wrong. And a chief executive could be treated by employees as wrong. It's one of the challenges you have changing a corporate mind. So there are various hands. Diego? Oh,
That's okay. I was
Alicia,
just
then
gonna
Diego.
say, if you've ever been an entrepreneur and you founded your own company, the values that you started your company with are like very real, you know?
Yeah.
And maybe they have like dubbed down a little bit if you're in the, you know, the seventh handoff. But I do think it's difficult to change a corporate mind unless it's something that,
You've got to persuade people to tell different stories,
It's a
right?
recruiting mechanism too.
yeah,
It's,
yes, exactly.
So I think there are two things going on. I think it's a recruitment mechanism. And I also think if you work there for long enough, the corporate mind starts to infect your mind.
Mm.
It changes what you are. So the way I tell this to students is imagine you're 20 and you've got two job offers. You could go and work for CNN or Goldman Sachs. You're not just choosing a career, you're choosing a future version of you.
absolutely.
You will, the corporate mind, you know, you might be attracted by the corporate mind, but where you go is going to affect what you are. I think this is a two-way process. Thinking of organization in these terms can give us quite a lot of stories. So I don't know your name.
Nicola.
Nicola.
So my question would be then, wouldn't it highly depend on how invested people are actually into these beliefs
Yeah.
and how you say, how extreme these beliefs, visions, intentions are? Because I mean that we can change, because for example, we decided that our company's color is blue and tomorrow we're
Right.
deciding that it's
Okay.
yellow. You know,
Point. So I think you're absolutely right. Things are really easy to change. I'm skipping around between slides because I'm sure have a conversation with you. So some of the things on this list, this is easy to change, right? The management of an organization can genuinely say, we're not building a new road, now we're building a bridge. And everyone will go, okay, we'll build a bridge. But if they said, we haven't got, they said, we no longer care about female empowerment. In fact, we're just going to start being really abusive to women. People would think that, people would say, no, we're not. I mean, some things are very easy to switch. Basically, intentions about the way the world looks physically might be easy to switch. Deeper held value type intentional states can be very hard to change because you just run up against opposition. There's a complicated, difficult leadership process of changing those intentional states by arguing through what people are arguing about.
but it would also be dependent on how these people are related to these values.
Yeah,
For
yeah,
some, you know,
yeah.
for
That's
some
right.
people, again, if I'm a woman, this would definitely 100% relate to me, and I would react to this. But I'm not saying that I should be very careful with my next words, but still, I mean, some people might go, yeah, well, they're paying enough.
Again, this depends on how deeply held these values are. If you go to an organization, Goldman Sachs is a good example. They have very deep stories. Has anyone worked for Goldman? I mean, maybe you have.
Interned and then went to WPP instead. So sort of did the Goldman or CNN thing.
Yeah, so I guess you saw exactly what I mean about the very deep values and stories that Goldman has. I mean, when you go to work for Goldman as a new recruit, they put you in a room and they tell you what we think, this is what we do, this is how we talk to each other. And they talk about what they are all the time. Goldman has a very deeply held sense of what Goldman Sachs is. So did Lehman Brothers. Turns out it wasn't a particularly useful story because it broke them, but these stories have real power. And so I take all of this, I have these intentional states, I think I take all this and I add a corporate mind. And that affects what contracts people write, what they're prepared to do. And of course, I could change it and it could be contested. But it's a useful way to think about this. Without something like that, this is a bazaar. And organizations are not bazaars, they're cathedrals, they're designed. They're entrepreneurial and they change in unexpected ways, not quite cathedrals, they're not pure bazaars. There is something bringing them together. So I'm aware that I'm going to run out of time, but I want to get back to the point that that you raised, or maybe I raised in response to you, Katerina, and that is, this is something that Lizzie Bennett does, and this is something the Body Shop does, and yet the Body Shop can't be anything or do anything unless someone acts for it. So the 30 of us get together and we have a conversation about what the Body Shop is. We understand the Body Shop wants to do this. If you work for the Body Shop, you understand what the Body Shop wants to do, but it might not be what you want to do. You may not have the same values as the Body Shop. So you know how the corporation views the world, you know what it wants to accomplish, and you can derive what the corporation would do if it could act, but it can't. Corporations are just think you said to me, they're just fictions. So why do you go ahead and take the action on behalf of the organization? This is a really interesting question. You're free agents, right? So what is it that makes you want to do whatever it is that's in the organization's collective story, which I'm calling a mind, because I need a word.
One of those contracts with me.
It might be a contract, but contracts are, my employment contract, I worked for investment bank for 6 years before my PhD. My contract was very short. It said, it literally said your hours of work, you work from Monday to Friday. Your hours of work are 37.5 hours per week, unless business conditions dictate otherwise. Every week. And that was full stop. And I got 4 weeks holiday a year, full stop. And then I kind of did what I was told, and I kind of did what I thought I ought to do. Contracts are deeply incomplete. But the contract does something where it makes me feel connected to the organization. It maybe gives me a sense of obligation.
And there's a remuneration component.
Yeah, it's a remuneration component. So you can think of the organization as being either a friend or an abusive partner or something, but something that says, I'd like you to do this. And if you do it, I'll keep paying you all this money. Or, you know, I'd like you to do this, and everyone around you would like you to do it too. You have a strong sense that you ought to do stuff for these organizations. They become things that actually have an impact on us, even though we made them up. We can argue passionately about what she do, but it's fun and pointless. This thing's got assets and shareholders, you know, capital. It can actually act on the world, and it creates these stories about what it is, and those stories make us do stuff. These are really profoundly important things. What the organization is all of these contracts, there's all the assets it owns, all of that, plus an understanding of what it's for that exists in the collective stories we tell each other as intelligent neurons, to use, not quite use your phrase, but use my version of your phrase. And those things have an effect on us. They make us feel like we should maybe take an action. So I've written this stuff up with my friend and co-author Rita Mota, who is obviously with a pronunciation like that, Portuguese. We talk about corporate minds as giving us reasons to act. When you're inside an organization, you kind of understand you ought to do this because of these individual states. And if you're acting for some other reason, you're not being properly corporate. So one question you might ask, given that we're running out of time, I'll skip some of the things I was thinking about doing, and just ask what this has got to do with corporate governance. So you can write down intentional states. So the one at the top, that was HSBC. I haven't shown you where the others came from. These are the British Army. The British Army has a list of values. This is a list of values. And this is General Motors. This is one of General Motors' values. It might be a lie, right? It might be real. I think this is real for the army. And whether HSBC values difference, empirical question. Okay, so we have a corporate mind. Let's just assume corporations have one. I think it kind of happens automatically. We do stuff together. We tell stories about what we're doing. Entrepreneurs do this a lot. Who said the entrepreneurial thing? Entrepreneurs do this. Was it you? Okay. My experience of entrepreneurs, they spend a lot of time talking about what they are in this sort of sense. So what's this got to do with corporate governance? Corporate governance is something that's both inward-facing and outward-facing. So I've got this thing that I've just invented called the corporate mind. So it's not really corporate mind, it's a sort of big brain thing with a stalk, right? Which exists because a whole bunch of people who work inside the organization tell stories about it to each other. And that affects the way that they behave and the way that they act. So these guys are speaking to each other, they're interacting with the organization. Their stories are the things that create that corporate mind. Okay, so far so good. What about people on the outside? People who are not inside the organization. If I start a business relationship with you, Krunal, I will have to find out about it, right? I need to know what sort of person you are. Otherwise, I can't possibly trust you. And I can't know what I can rely upon you to do, and you can't know what business requires us to understand more than just the fact that we can write a contract. I have to understand something about you. Something like this going on here, when I deal with the Body Shop, perhaps the reason I buy cosmetics from the Body Shop is I want to buy cruelty-free cosmetics. I need to understand that cruelty-free is one of the things inside one of the intentional states, one of the things that drives the Body Shop. So it seems to me important that the person on the outside knows what's inside the corporate mind. Okay, so how do they find out?
Getting
Yep, that's one, marketing, comms. That's one thing. Anything else?
Well, like you were saying before, they can say that they have, I can't see the word diversity inclusion, but if you look at their board of directors or their upper management, do they have 50-50 men and women? Do they have
Right.
ethnic minorities? So you can actually dig beyond the marketing and say, do they actually have those values in their business?
So I think there are various things going on. One is straightforward communications. Another is just reasonable expectations.
who sets those expectations, like when you're talking about diversity?
These are social expectations. So you made a perfectly fair comment. You said every organization these days is concerned with diversity and inclusion.
Right.
I think it's reasonable to assume when you encounter an organization that it's probably these days concerned with D&I, but not all organizations are. So it might be that something flows into my head about organizations within the oil sector, and I assume they're not very concerned about the environment. And it turns out they are, because, you know, for example, BP trying quite hard to be green.
Yeah.
So a blanket assumption about the entire oil sector would be grossly unfair, but maybe I have one in my head. That's why BP does comms. It says, actually, your priors about oil companies, in our case, are wrong, for example.
So it's kind of like just upsetting any expectations for you.
I think one purpose of comms is to make sure the expectations are accurate. And then I can look at actions. In some sense, I can pick something up from actions. Okay, so I think this is a good picture of organizations and the outside world. It's a picture that I've created in no time at all. What's corporate governance got to do with this?
I was going to say that it seems like there are other players in this.
Oh, a bunch, tons of
Like
players,
news
yeah.
media, for example, is going to be another.
The news media is very important. So the actions could be watched by all sorts of people, and the all sorts of people could tell the rest of the world.
Yeah.
So one of the purposes of comms is to reach people who can communicate for you, like the media. So I agree with all that. So let's just think about what a good organization looks like. So is an organization that allows you to believe it has a bunch of characteristics when it doesn't really have those. Is that a well-governed organization? That feels to me like a badly governed organization. I do not have time to go into this in detail, so come and do an end. But I think one way to think about corporate governance is what organizations do to make sure that what people believe about corporate minds is the truth. So if the Metropolitan Police, for example, because it's had a lot of stick lately, says, we're an organization that is completely, concerned about respect for women. This is right now an aspiration and not a fact. If they're well governed, they say this is our aspiration, we're working to achieve it, we have problems right now, now they're telling you the truth about what's in their corporate mind. And if they say it's an aspiration and working to achieve it, their governance has got to involve working to achieve it. So I'm going to define corporate governance as being making sure that perceptions of the corporate mind are accurate. Of course, this needs a lot more teasing out, not huge amounts of time. Somebody flashed a hand up and flashed it down again. Yeah.
But can corporate governance be judged like, for example, it is a voluntarily set of markers that a company wants to be judged against?
I'm defining it differently. I'm saying corporate governance is what you do to make sure that what people understand you to be is what you are. So let me tell you why I think this is a useful definition. Let's finish on one picture. Do you think the mafia is well governed?
Yes.
Very well governed. Is it an admirable or moral organization? Absolutely not. But you know what you're getting, right? The mafia has a whole bunch of values: respect, loyalty, omerta. It will break your legs if you don't repay the loan. It will burn your business down if you don't pay protection money. But it does exactly what it tells you it's going to do. What you think the mafia is, I'm assuming, is what the mafia is. Although what I think the mafia is comes from this movie, The Sopranos, so it may not be completely accurate. But I think most people, when you show them the mafia, agree it's well governed. And that proves to me that governance and morality are irrelevant. And the mafia, I'm sure, would love you to think something else about them, but what you understand the mafia to be is what the mafia is. And it can survive weirdly with that set of values. Many organizations will collapse immediately if we believe them to be exactly what they are and they didn't fix it. But you know, saying we're going to improve this and then working to improve it is what makes good public governance. So remember, intentionality isn't just about what you are now, it's also about what you expect the world to look like in the future. So struggling with the mouse. Oh, it's because the mouse has vanished. Okay, I'll completely have to do it this way. Going back to this thing, right? Some of this stuff is about intentions about the future. So we intend that we lose our canteen culture. But right now, it is a fact that we have a canteen culture. And those two statements are statements that will be far more admirable than just a lie that right now we have no problem. If we say we have no problem right now, we will never fix it because we don't acknowledge that it's something we need to do. So making a statement about what you are now is going to include policy statements. And then you have to work to make sure that these things are true, that makes you well governed. Well, moral, if these policy statements are admirable policy statements, and that's a bigger and more difficult question when we have time for in a teaser 1 hour conversation. I really can't let this thing work, so I'm just going to do this. Okay, so I'm not going to talk about everything I was going to talk about. In fact, I think I'm going to stop there because I've done my hour and you have all sorts of interesting things to do today. So I'm trying to make the point that to understand organizations, we can't just look at the contracts and we can't just look at the cash flows, although as somebody trained in economics, I think those things are very important. We also have to look at the things that people understand organizations to be as kind of collections of goals, desires, intentions, attitudes towards the world, which collectively I'm calling a corporate mind. They come about through that storytelling that we did when we talked about Lizzie Bennet. And then people feel them as reasons to act, partly because they're paid and partly because of just social pressure. You sign up to an organization, in some sense you feel you're obliged to do what the organization would like you to do. So what you understand the organization wanting you to do is very important. That's what the corporate mind is giving you. Corporate governance is about managing and communicating that, and that seems to me to be an absolutely critical leadership task. Okay, I'll stop there. Are there any final questions? In that case, we're done. Nice to meet you.